Hi there, welcome back to episode 10 of the Reel Film Chronicles. As always, I'm Nathan.
My name is Brian.
And today, we're going to be discussing a little film called In the Earth.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. You got yourself a nice drink there?
Absolutely.
Perfect, I got one. And I cannot believe that we're at episode 10 already. This feels like a pretty major accomplishment for us. I'm proud of what we've done so far. And honestly, I'm really thankful that we have some listeners, and I want to thank everybody who has been listening and giving some feedback to us. This has been a neat little experiment turned into a really nice little hobby, an extension of our movie watching hobby.
Absolutely, and I just want to thank you, yes, you, listening right now. You're making all this possible. Thank you, and have yourself a great day.
Fantastic. So, In the Earth is a 2021 film written and directed by Ben Wheatley, who has done a few other movies that you might have heard of, including Free Fire, High Rise, and Rebecca. It stars a few people that I'm not familiar with, but I think are very capable actors and actresses. And I'm probably going to pronounce some of these names wrong. Stars Joel Fry, Ellora Torchia, Haley Squires, and Reese Shearsmith. And there's a couple other actors who are in there for maybe a few minutes of screen time. But this is a pretty focused film with just these four actors throughout most of the runtime. I want to talk about the overview of this, and I'm hoping that it doesn't get into too many spoilers, because I went into this movie completely blind. What about you, Nathan?
I went in having seen the trailer for it, but I think after having watched it, this is a pretty spoiler-proof movie.
Yeah.
Just based on the actual events and what happens, and it's not a straightforward kind of maybe linear narrative. So, but yeah, we'll get into a spoiler-free discussion first, and then move into huge spoiler territory.
Yeah, fantastic. I went in completely blind. I blame you for liking or disliking this movie. You brought it to the table here, and I was pretty intrigued. I saw the poster. I got a brief sense of what it was. I was just like, all right, this should be good. But here's the overview as provided at Letterboxd. As a deadly virus ravages the world, Dr. Martin Lowry embarks on a mission to reach test site ATU 327A, a research hub deep in the arboreal forest. The arduous journey, guided by Park Scout Alma, is set by a nighttime attack that leaves the two bruised and shoeless. When they run into Zach, a man living off the grid, they gratefully accept his help. Zach's intentions aren't exactly what they seem, however, and a path out of the forest and into safety quickly fades as the line between myth and science blurs. Are you intrigued by that?
I am, although I am kind of glad I didn't read that before I watched the movie. Because there was just that bit about Zach was almost like spoilerish, because
it is.
I don't want to say why, but
yeah, I mean, it basically, like, if you read that whole thing, I think that you have a pretty good overview of what the movie is going to be. There is a lot more to the film, of course. And before we delve into spoilers, because as we normally do, we recommend a film after we discuss it, I'd like to do a very quick, maybe maximum 2 minutes, if you want to talk about your initial reactions to the film and do you recommend it or not. Nathan, I'll let you go first.
Well, thank you, Brian. So this movie was nothing like I expected. I haven't seen any of Ben Wheatley's other work. There's been a couple of movies that have been on my list, but I wasn't sure exactly what to expect. And the trailer was a little bit misleading in a sense. Just the tone in the trailer and some of the images made it seem a lot different than it actually ended up being. Mm-hmm. And the first half, it was a bit more kind of standard horror film kind of setups. And then in the second half, it got into a little bit crazier, maybe more, shall we say, to use a metaphor that's appropriate for this movie, off the beaten path in terms of subject matter and in terms of plots. So I was going in really hopeful with this one, and if I'm being honest, I was a little bit let down in the end. Just because I don't mind ambiguity in my films. I don't mind having things a bit vague or not spelled out. But this one, I felt by the end, things were just a little bit too ambiguous, too amorphous, not enough real meat to sink my teeth into. And I mean, it was a really, I know this is a terribly banal descriptor. It was a really interesting movie. If I had to give a recommendation, I would say anybody outside of hardcore horror fans, you're probably not going to like this one. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody outside of Ben Wheatley fans or hardcore horror fans looking for something new. But other than that, maybe that's surprising, Brian. I don't know what your thoughts are, but I wasn't as blown away by this movie. It may require repeated viewings to really sink my teeth into it. First impressions, though, it wasn't like a modern horror classic, to use another kind of cliched term, like when I saw Midsummer and Hereditary and The Endless for the first time. Those movies the first time, or The Void for the first time, they blew me away. I was immediately in love. I didn't get that same sense with In the Earth. It didn't draw me in the same way.
Last week, after the podcast, we kind of talked about possibly disagreeing on a film. And how would that play out in the podcast recording? And we did not talk about this movie at all after we both watched it. We were both aware that we watched it last week. And I'm thinking, I wonder if Nathan enjoys this movie, because I sure as hell did not.
Don't tell
Essentially,
me. Did we just agree again?
We just agreed again, and I think you kind of summed it up really well there. There's not a lot in this film that I could grab a hold of, not a lot that really grabbed my attention. This movie is a bit longer than it needs to be for the amount of content in it, and it really is quite obvious you're watching a low-budget indie film that takes place in the woods, and I think that might be a genre upon itself. There are other movies that take place in the woods with similar themes that I think get a lot more mileage, would be a lot better value for you to watch than In the Earth. I do not recommend this movie. There's not a lot of interesting things happening here necessarily, but the interesting things that do happen are pretty neat. There's some good concepts here. I can't get into it. Ben Wheatley's films, I've only watched one other one, 2015 film called High Rise, stars Tom Hiddleston. I gave it 2 stars. I did not care for it. I forgot about it immediately afterwards. And that was one of my fears with this movie. I'm probably going to forget about this in a few days, so it's good that we're getting this recording in right now.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I hate to say it, I think you're correct about the kind of forgettability factor. I can feel this one kind of fading a bit faster than a lot of movies. It didn't make that upfront impression that I was really hoping for. Again, the marketing for this, whoever was doing the marketing for this movie, whatever you're paying them, double it, because the trailers and everything, they were amazing.
So with our recommendations out of the way, I would say we're going to get into heavy spoiler territory, and I think we should probably begin with just that general overview where we have Martin and Alma setting out on this journey to find another doctor. I think it's Dr. Olivia. It's really unclear to me, and maybe I just missed it in the dialogue, but the movie kind of opens up with Martin showing up at this, I want to say, remote forest research station where they have a few people working. They get their hand sanitizer going. They're scanning each other.
Right.
There's some virus going on in the world. I don't get a sense of really what the virus is at the beginning, which is fine, because maybe they'll explain it later on. And spoiler alert, they do not. I don't really understand the severity of the virus. It's just like, all right, we're out here in the woods. This guy's going in here. And the next day, him and a forest ranger, Alma, who knows the forest so well, I guess, they have to go find this other researcher to do something. I don't know what they're doing. Maybe it doesn't matter, but they have to go find this other researcher. And as they go out, they basically encounter some weird stuff. They encounter an abandoned camp, like just a tent, that had some children's toys at it. And not soon afterwards, they are spending the night in the woods in their tents, and they are attacked. They take everything, including their shoes, which is an important plot point. Their shoes are gone. And at the very, very beginning of the movie, we see somebody in the woods setting up kind of like a trap where they put sharpened objects under the leaves on the forest floor.
Would you say they put them in the earth?
they put them in the earth. So at that point, Martin steps on presumably that broken piece of glass or whatever, that trap, and cuts his foot open. And then they find Zach, who is willing to help them out, right? At that point, I mean, Zach's intentions in the overview pretty quickly turn malicious, and he is doing some kind of spiritual ritual to them, having them pose in certain ways, like drugging them first, dressing them up in a certain way, and then taking photographs of them. Does that about sum up that very beginning? It's just like, okay, now the movie's kind of saying, all right, Zach is kind of our antagonist here, who's gonna mess up our researchers.
Yeah, so that's a pretty good summary of that first part. So one of the things that really struck me was this was clearly a post-pandemic movie, in the same way that we saw after major world events like 9/11, where you had like post 9/11 kind of sensibilities, post 9/11 topics, where this one's clearly set during, it doesn't say COVID-19, but there's some other pandemic, some other virus that is causing people to isolate and quarantine. They're having to go, this may sound familiar to a lot of us. They're wearing masks, they're getting disinfectant, they're doing blood tests to make sure people are free of the virus. So it was really interesting putting it in that context of, like very kind of modern context, right? Something that we're all familiar with, to really frame that well. And taking, Martin and Alma as the two main characters. And one thing I really did like about the film was how these weren't superheroes, right? Mm-hmm. They weren't superhuman. These were just regular people, and the actors really did a phenomenal job of just selling this, like, these are regular people in like extraordinary circumstances, and they kind of reacted accordingly. Like when Zach shows up, like, first of all, like they come across that abandoned tent, like you said, and it's all like, it's kind of ragged, like it's been attacked. And then shortly afterwards, like when they're sleeping in their tents, they are like attacked and beaten and left with nothing, and their shoes are taken. And then when Zach shows up, immediately, as soon as he's like, he explains how he's like, living illegally in this, protected land. And it was like, but if you don't tell, I won't, kind of thing. And it's like, I'll help you out. And it's like, oh yeah, come with me, I've got some shoes that you can borrow. And all of a sudden it's like, the warning signs are kind of going off in your head. It's like, why the heck would this random dude living in the woods, why would he have spare shoes that he could just lend us?
This is a nightmare scenario. Sorry to interrupt you. Did you have something
go ahead.
else to add there? I was just going to say, this is a nightmare scenario because they're going barefoot through these woods. Martin cuts his foot. And what's worse than trying to get through woods with no shoes on? There's dangers everywhere. When you're out hiking, you basically got to watch pretty much every step, right? I completely forgot, like, this is a protected forest area, but do they really explain why it's protected? Do they explain?
I think it's just like a conservation area like we would have here. So the other thing too is they kept setting up early on. There's this spirit of the woods. Was it Parnag Feg? It's just like it's set up as like local folklore, but it eventually becomes important later on in the movie. But yeah, at the beginning, they're really trying to set up, and it felt to me almost like, it reminded me a little bit of movies like Antichrist, where it was looking at nature as not something that's harmonious, but something that is a force of chaos, and it's a force of potential danger rather than, like, as opposed to, necessarily like there's myths of birth and rebirth that are associated with nature, but there's also, in this case, it was like that's scary, don't go in the woods at night, like there's dangers out there that you're not aware of, and setting that up and setting like establishing the woods and the forested areas as not like some pastoral setting where everything was in harmony, but a place of potential danger, right, or potential chaos.
Yeah, this isn't like the all-carrying Mother Nature that is providing a nice forest for them, right? This is like Mother Nature's evil cousin out there in these particular woods.
Right. So you got at the very beginning, and this becomes one of the main themes early on. So you have, the flu, this mystery virus that's going around and it's being treated in a very scientific manner, and then right beside all that kind of science, and like Martin is going out, he's doing research in this forest, and like you said, I don't know if it was clear in the movie, I was reading afterwards, but when I was watching the movie, I got the sense that they kept saying it was very fertile land. So so I was thinking is like, oh, they were doing some kind of research related to agriculture, or that was like the cover story. But then in relation to that science, right next to it is this mythology of Parnag Fag and the spirits of the forest. So you have the science and the mythology kind of juxtaposed against each other right from the beginning of the film. So there is that kind of through line. It's not really, in my perspective, it's not really dealt with in a really kind of deeper, meaningful way later on, but it is there. It's something. It's one of the kind of main themes of the movie, I think.
Yeah. So, kind of revisiting our plot here. Our researchers are in Zach's camp and they're tending to Martin's foot. This is the first shocking moment of the film for me, where we get a fairly close up, like detailed view of the cut on his foot. And it is crazy how nasty it is. Were you at all shocked at the level of gore that was in this movie?
A little bit. I didn't think it was going to be that gory, because when he cut his foot, they quickly wrapped it up at the time, and we didn't get a good look at it until they were in Zach's tent there, and it was just like, it was a huge cut right down the middle where, like Zach said, is like, oh yeah, it's like flapping around there. It's like, it was,
he needed stitches.
It wasn't shocking in the way that like Friday the 13th movie is shocking with its gore. It was just shocking. It was shocking more because like it felt like a real world injury that you could sustain, and it was like, because the whole movie doesn't feel like it feels like it's very kind of set in reality. So it feels like that's an injury that you or I could get walking through the woods. It felt very real and visceral, and the makeup was great.
Oh yeah, and I think most of it, probably all of it, were quite well done practical special effects. Because what were some of the other gore scenes? There's somebody gets an arrow in the eye. Well, what happened to Zach's eye at one point? Right,
and so what you're talking about is like Zach. He gives them their shoes, right? He helps. First of all, he's like super friendly. He takes them he has this big like kind of tent house set up with like, it's all tarps and stuff. But immediately right away, it's like, oh, there's one section in the one room is like, you can't come in here. Mm-hmm. It's like, I keep this like germ free or so, whatever his excuse was.
Yeah, but it's like a clean room for him.
Yeah, but then he comes back. He's like giving them food. He gives them their shoes. He helps stitch up Martin's foot. It's like, oh, okay, so maybe there's just like, he's a kindly, eccentric old man, but all of a sudden it's like they start to get woozy and they collapse and they wake up and they're tied up. But in the meantime, since they were passed out, he takes them and he dresses them in these like, it looks like white robes made of like tarp that he's cut. So he dresses them in these white robes with these headdresses on, and he cuts out like these white pieces that go over their eyes. Very kind of reminiscent of, there's a lot of like pagan imagery there. Mm-hmm. Like stuff that you see, or at least like pagan in the sense of like cinematic, pagan in the cinematic language, right? Where you see a lot of the stuff in like in Midsummer or obviously The Wicker Man and all those kind of ancient rituals. But he's dressing them up and he's posing them on the ground and he's taking pictures of them. And then they wake up, and then the next gory thing comes along. Which, do you want to talk about this? This one took me completely by surprise. Like the foot was one thing. But then,
was this the part where they hit him in the head with something?
It was the part where
they're cutting off his toes.
Yeah, like all of a sudden, like Martin is just like, not Martin, Zach is just like, he seems to be getting crazier and crazier, where he's just like, he tells Martin, and he's like being all kind about it. He's like, yeah, I think your foot's really infected, and we're just gonna have to amputate part of it. Like we can't get you to the hospital in time. It's impossible.
I gotta say, like, as a horror movie loving fan, I really enjoyed the scene where he's so concerned about Martin's foot. As he said, he thinks it's infected. We're gonna have to remove a couple of toes, he says, very matter-of-factly as well, right? But he gives Martin an option. He's just like, well, we have two options. We can go to the hospital, or we can take care of this right now. Martin, of course, says, let's go to the hospital. And I'm also kind of pulled out of the movie thinking, are hospitals still running in this world, like this kind of post-pandemic world? And I think Zach says, oh, the hospital is 30 miles away, and very clearly they're going to have to walk that distance. Martin's in no shape to go that way. Zach has no intention of letting him go to the hospital, and he takes his axe out, has Martin like bound to the chair and his foot on like a tree stump, and says, okay, well, we can take care of this. My axe is very sharp. And he basically kind of fakes him out a couple of times where he's taking like a practice swing. He's like, no, I'm just aiming. I'm, practicing for my aim here. And it's absolutely terrifying because every time the axe comes down, it's a very hard thunk. In the movie, it's just like, okay, when are these toes coming off? And I think he misses a couple of times, and then he finally gets it. 2 or 3 blows to take off 2 or 3 toes.
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of creepy thing where Zach is like feigning, well, you're not sure. Is he actually concerned for him and he's just completely warped in his own mind, or is he just messing with him, or is there somewhere in between? But like,
yeah, exactly. Like, you get the impression this guy could be crazy. He could be living out here alone, where you have the impression that like Martin was at his own home somewhere, just isolating. He's partnering up with these researchers in the woods. We know that there's a menace out there who attacked our researchers earlier, and now do we sympathize with Martin and Alma as well as Zach? Like, Zach has been able to stay safe, but also how does Zach have this tent house set up while remaining safe? Who are the attackers? And of course, I mean, we discover that Zach was the attacker, right?
It's a pretty sweet tent setup, but I also got to say, the way he does that, the cutting off the toes with Martin, where he fakes him out first, I mean, that clearly sets him up. He's clearly an antagonist in this, but that method he uses is something that a method that terrorists will use, right? When you see these, when you see these videos of people who are making, hostages that are taken by terrorists, and they're made to give these statements, and then they're like executed, like while it's being filmed, and you see them, and they're not fighting back, and they're not struggling. It's because what happens? It was revealed later on through, they studied this, and it turns out that the terrorists would actually do a bunch of fake runs, where it's like, oh yeah, we're gonna take you out, we're gonna kill you on camera now, and then and they keep doing that for like a couple days, and eventually you're just like, oh, they keep saying they're gonna kill me, but they're not gonna kill me. So it's like, okay, we're doing this again, and then there's that one time that they finally kill you. So this is actually like a real world psychological technique that that captors and terrorists will use with their hostages to manipulate them psychologically, right?
That kind of adds a new dynamic on top of that scene.
A different kind of horror, right?
Yeah. That's pretty wild. So what happens after they remove the toes? I mean, I think earlier Zach dropped like a small blade on the ground inside the tent.
Yeah, and so he drugs them up again, and he takes them out individually this time. So he takes Martin out and he dresses him up again in these kind of ritual robes, and he's taking pictures of him. And while he's doing that, Alma goes over, knocks her chair over, squirms across the ground, gets the blade, and frees herself. But also before that, we just skipped over something, an important point there. At one point where he was torturing them, he had them set out individually outside, just under these tarps. Oh, yes. And then he starts to explain kind of what he's doing, that there's specifically with Parnag Feg, this spirit of the forest, and he's trying to communicate with it essentially by using these rituals and by worshiping it and by giving it sacrifices, which again, as soon as you hear the word sacrifice and you got people tied up, it's raising those stakes again. But essentially, he believes in this spirit and that there's this other worldly power out in the woods, and he thinks that he's essentially kind of like a priest, that's praying to this deity or to this force, and he's trying to communicate with it. And that's what he uses as a rationale for capturing and torturing and eventually, as we find out, executing, murdering people in the name of this forest spirit, right? So that's what his whole deal is. But then Alma gets free. He comes back in, and then the next kind of gory thing, like she smashes him with some of his. He has a whole like photography, development studio set up in there.
His clean tent that they weren't allowed in was full of his photography. It was basically a dark room in the middle of the woods.
Dark room, yeah.
And of course, it has all the photographs that he's taking pictures of them as well as all his other victims, and they're all stored in there. So obviously, they weren't allowed to see that earlier on. But Alma basically smashes him in the head a couple of times, I think, but noticeably right on the forehead. And that turns into quite a gory moment. Not necessarily at that time, but later on you kind of see that, like they end up going on a chase through the woods, and near the end of that scene you see just how gaping and nasty that gash in his forehead is, and you're like, it's literally like a loose flap of skin coming off his head. And I'm just like, again, shocked that this type of gore is in this kind of seemingly like more of a tense, creepy indie film than it is sort of a sensational, gory horror film. But, it works. It had me creeped out.
It did, yeah. It was really good. So they escape, and part of their plan was they're going to run in separate directions to kind of distract them. And then, Martin was going to go meet up with Dr. Olivia Wendell, who it turns out was not just a coworker, but they used to have a relationship. And then Alma's going to, draw Zach's attention and circle back around to meet them at the camp. Yeah. They do. They get away from Zach, who chases them down. He's got a bow and arrow too. Like, this guy is the best stocked camper I've ever seen.
Yeah, he's well
pretty
stocked
amazing.
Out there.
It's like the best stocked hobo.
Well, that's what I didn't understand half the time is that, do they live out there full time? Like, does Zach live there because the cities are unsafe at this point because of the pandemic?
Well, so the thing was, as we find out later, that Zach also was an ex-husband of Dr. Olivia Wendell. And so they presumably went out there to research together. They're both scientists. So he started off at Dr. Olivia's camp, or Dr. Wendell's camp, right? And then he kind of, as they were researching out there, he kind of went a little bit crazy. But he said in the movie too that he goes in like once a month for supplies into town.
Yeah.
So he's making supply runs, and presumably he's got some cash or a credit card somewhere. It's not clear how long he's been out there. We see a couple dead bodies, but not enough to really gauge.
Very poorly stashed.
Yeah, very poorly stashed,
bodies.
And they're still, they haven't decomposed that much. So
it was all very recent.
Yeah.
So this chase scene, obviously with the bow and arrow, we follow mainly Martin because he's kind of hobbling along. He's got the messed up foot now. Not only does he have a gash in his foot, and it was very hastily, crudely stitched together. He just had a couple toes freshly removed. So he's going through the woods, and he's on the ground, and he finds a power cord, and he starts following the power cord, and it comes up to lights and a speaker on a tree, and then we see a microphone hanging from one of the branches, and it's like, okay, well, this movie is just kind of flipped on its head here. What's happening now? Because we were kind of under the impression that Zach lives out there off the grid, no electricity. And the psychedelic kind of madness begins here because somebody comes over the speakers no, don't come any closer. This is like a protected area. Lights start flashing, sounds start coming out of the speakers, and they're not just I don't know how to describe these sounds, kind of these droning, interesting.
Yeah, so here the movie kind of fails me on a couple levels because first you have. It was breaking down to be just a standard kind of slasher flick where even at that point, Zach was stalking Martin through the forest. He had an axe and he was swinging it around wildly. So it's he had a literal axe wielding maniac chasing through the woods. And then all of a sudden it switches to, all of a sudden you have there's speakers on the trees and strobe lights, and there's strobe lights flashing and this weird music going, and it's they really should have had a seizure warning on this movie. I don't know if they did or not.
Yeah.
And this happens for much of the last half of the movie is just there's a ton of strobe lights and a ton of that that noise. And it's
Yeah.
like, I'm not usually prone to this stuff, but even I was like starting to get a headache watching this stuff. It was just like really distracting and really kind of too much and over the top.
Yeah. I think you nailed it right there. This part of the movie is where a lot of people would lose interest because so some context here is basically this is Dr. Wendell's camp that they were trying to find earlier. It's not that far away from Zach's camp, which is, suspect, as you would expect here.
Yeah.
And they find her, and it's like, okay, well, this is good. It's kind of a safe area at first, but honestly, it's not a safe area. The other plot twist that's coming is that she is kind of just as bad as Zach, but she's going through things a bit differently. And this is the main part that I liked, is that she was trying to communicate with nature in a more scientific way, just juxtaposed to Zach's spiritual worshiping contact with nature, right? And as they're in this camp, Alma and Martin are basically saying, well, we got to head back to the main research center here. We got to figure out what's going on. And I don't even know where to go from here. Like, what happens next? The movie kind of slows down, but also just gets really strange. There's this presence of Zach outside the border of her camp. And I think at one point she even says, oh, well, Zach is my ex-husband. Like, they were together. And of course, as soon as she says that, you're thinking, okay, well, they're probably in on this together here, right?
Yeah, potentially. So she goes and she starts explaining what they're actually doing out there, sort of, where she is talking again about communicating with this presence in nature, right? So she got the microphone set up and she talks about how trees and plants emit sounds and how essentially there's how different plants are able to act as essentially like nodes in a network. So like the forest and I don't know if it's all of nature or just a specific forest is essentially acting as one giant brain, or that's what she thinks, because she's getting these patterns in these sounds that she's recording. And it's she's able to interpret that, and essentially it's sending some kind of message to them. And so the whole point of so Parnag Feg is revealed to be essentially some kind of ancient language. I don't know what the language was, maybe Celtic or something. Well, let's say Celtic, sure. But essentially it means sound and light. And so the speakers emitting that really annoying sound and all the strobe lights are her attempts to essentially communicate with this entity that's out in the woods that could be potentially either part of the woods or the woods themselves, or using the woods as its kind of brain, essentially. Yeah. And we find out later that there's a certain type of fungus that actually plays a part in this, a certain kind of mushroom that emits this spore that is part of that kind of that network or that living brain. And it seems at first that she is trying to use these scientific methods to communicate. And she's like, what is nature trying to tell us? And this would be an incredible breakthrough. Like, how can we live in harmony with nature? Right. And we're using these apparently scientific methods. But as it turns out later on, again, she just like with Zach, right? Zach started off showing with kindness, like, come with me. I'll give you some food. I'll give you some clothes. Yeah. The Dr. Wendell says, like, yeah, no problem. I'll cauterize your wounds. Like, stay with me, and we'll do this research together. We'll figure out what's going on, right? And then we'll get back into town once we communicated with nature.
Yeah. Basically, the light show and the sounds. I mean, I like these audio, visual things, but it really was too much. And I'm sitting here watching this movie in a dark room, and it's just like, man, this is excessive. The sound was wild. I was basically riding the volume on my stereo system quite a bit, because there's some really, bassy noises coming out of this thing that I'm thinking my neighbors are going to be complaining about soon. But man, there's that scene where they decide to go out of the perimeter, and this is Alma who says, I'm going to go out, go back to camp and get basically help.
Yeah, so and just to clarify here, the perimeter of the camp, they wake up one morning and all of a sudden there's this mist or this fog, this ring of fog around the camp, but what it is it's not just fog, it's carrying these spores from this fungi that have emitted all these spores, and apparently, and like the mist is just like staying at an exact distance away from the camp all the way around, and they can't get through this. Every time they get get close to these spores, they start hallucinating, and then they eventually collapse and lose consciousness. So that's why they need to use that. Alma's trying to get out using this specialized kind of hazmat equipment.
Yeah, exactly. Like she's wearing the gas mask, she's got goggles on, and she's got the tarp suit on, but very clearly is not like fully hazmat rated. And she gets out there, they tie a rope around her waist so that they can pull her back just in case. And yeah, she basically starts tripping hard when she goes through this thing. But it was kind of like, when I'm watching it, I'm thinking, man, is this like a poor man's annihilation happening here at this point? I don't know what's going on. They pull her back. It's terrifying, etc. I don't know. We're well into the movie here, and I'm just like, I don't know what's going on, and I don't have a ton of interest in what was happening. I'm pretty well convinced at this point that the movie isn't going to give us much explanation on what is happening.
Yeah, and then finally, Zach shows up at one point at the camp. He gets really close. And then Dr. Wendell goes over and talks to him, see what's going on. And she comes back and is like, we tried all the scientific methods to talk to this thing. I think we need to look at, she has this ancient book of, all these rites and rituals. So she's slowly leading Martin down this path, right? Of just like an inch at a time. It's like it starts with science and it slowly devolves into this mysticism where they're like their last attempt, because now the fog with these fungal spores is closing in on the camp. It's like our last attempt. So there's this stone. And that's kind of like the epicenter of all these sounds and communication attempts from this entity out in nature, whether it's supernatural or whether it's just alien to us. The standing stone, they call it. And it's just a tall kind of obelisk with like a hole cut through the middle of it.
Yeah.
Apparently, I was doing some research afterwards. These stones show up not necessarily with the hole, but like standing stones are a common thing in a lot of cultures. You'll see them pop up as landmarks in a lot of different places. But it's like, yeah. So Dr. Wendell's like, here in the book, there's this, this recipe using a bunch of these mushrooms to make this sacrament, which is this drink. And Martin is like,
that's right.
Martin goes out to the standing stone. It's like, this is our last attempt to kind of communicate with it. They need this sacrifice. It's like, okay, I'll drink this concoction, and then we're gonna, blast it with these lights and sounds again to try and make this one last ditch effort to communicate with it. As it turns out, Zach and Dr. Wendell are in it together, and Zach goes up and he intends to kill Martin as the fully sacrifice to as a last ditch effort to communicate with this thing and let them all go free. How he gets through the mist with the spores and everything, that's anybody's guess. But then Alma comes upon him before he's able to do anything, and she I think hits him again with a branch or something.
Yeah, she drives a stick into his eye.
Well, that's later on. So she goes back.
Oh, so it's later on. Sorry.
Yeah, so like she drives off Zach so he doesn't kill Martin right away. But she gets knocked out in the process somehow. She goes back. She finds out that this Dr. Wendell also had a safe room, right? That like, you can't go in here. It's sterile. She goes in. She's playing this eerie piano, and all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, she's got pictures that Zach's taken of his eerie rituals all over the walls. And then she beats Dr. Wendell with like a barrel of supplies, beats her, bludgeons her with the head, and then like Zach shows up, and then she takes a tent peg, jams it into his eye, and
awesome.
There's this really kind of darkly comedic moment where Zach stumbles backwards. He picks up a mirror and he's looking at this horrible wound where his eye used to be, and he's like, oh, I think we need to go to a hospital. You need to take me to a hospital. And instead, she rushes forward and punches the tent peg right back into his brain.
Yeah.
And he goes down. All he sees is like the leg twitching, and it's just like this horrible kind of where like Alma is forced to defend herself, but it's still this horrible kind of body horror.
It was really horrific body horror. It was just I feel like at one point he kind of thought about trying to pull the tent peg out, but found that his eye was coming out with it, so he elects not to.
I
go
thought
that
for
that
sure
route.
we were going to see an eyeball pulled out.
Yeah, it was pretty grotesque. And again, I was kind of surprised at how grotesque it was at this point. I kind of enjoy seeing those things in movies, in my horror films, but I was not expecting it here, and it kind of felt out of place, to be frank with you. I thought it would be a little more of an atmospheric a film in the woods, but there we are.
And then so it ends off. Alma goes up to find Martin, but then like that spore cloud moves in, and all of a sudden we're treated to this kaleidoscopic array of hallucinogenic images that are flashing through their minds of things that have happened in the film, things that have happened in their life, and a bunch of other stuff that makes kind of not a whole lot of sense. And then it's like flashes, oh, it's morning now. And Dr. Wendell is like out in the woods. She wandered off and she just like collapses out of sheer, I guess, just the sheer overwhelming force of all these images. And then Alma is also out in the woods and she kind of wakes up and goes and finds Martin, he's waking up by the standing stone where he had passed out from that funky mushroom drink that Dr. Wendell had given him.
Yep.
And I guess they'd all kind of, I don't know if it was meant to be that they'd all shared the same visions or that they'd all had their own trips out there, but essentially Alma's just like, come on, I'll show you the way home now. And then it just ends.
It just ends right there. Yeah, we really don't get any answers on things. And to be fair, I don't need answers on every film, every weird thing that goes on in a film, but this one it didn't feel like, I don't know, I walked away quite unsatisfied. It's like I needed a little more with that. And I'm thinking, all right, I'm kind of comparing this to other horror films in the woods, and it's like, is the message of this movie is just that no, there's no monster in the woods. It's just humans again. Humans are the monster. It's just like I've seen this trope too many times. I needed a little more legitimacy to, this forest spirit being absolutely real. Or was it just everyone was out in the woods high on the psychedelic mushrooms, right?
Well, that's the thing. At the end, I don't mind ambiguity in film. I don't mind having to think for myself and figure things out. For me, that's part of the fun of these films. Like things like one of my favorite films we were just talking about earlier, Donnie Darko. Is like nothing is really solved. You have to work at that film, right? You have to figure out what it means. But the problem with In the Earth was there wasn't enough to sink your teeth into, really. There wasn't enough substance. There weren't enough puzzle pieces that you could reasonably fill in the blanks yourself to make a picture that made sense. Like at the end, like Alma seemed kind of out of it still. So like, is she being controlled by this entity / spirit? Like, is it an actual entity or is it supernatural, right? Or is it just like or just alien to us? Like, did they actually commune with this thing? Did they have some kind of path forward to live harmoniously with nature? Obviously, that's tying back to living through a pandemic, right? Which is a great metaphor for that kind of disharmony with nature, where we're at odds with nature. Like, I don't know. There's nothing really in there to indicate one way or the other. Yeah, and it's kind of frustrating in a sense.
Yeah, I really did enjoy that. It's kind of like this man and wife, Zach and Olivia, the doctor, came about trying to commune with this spirit in different ways. I liked that, like the spiritual methods to the scientific methods, and they have just decided, all right, well, we're going to try our own thing, a couple 100 feet away from each other, right? And I think what would have really satisfied me at the end is all the stuff is going on, is that Zach could have been the sacrifice that was needed, and maybe because they had all these speakers in the woods and lights, if we understand that all the equipment was destroyed in the fight between Alma and Dr. Wendell, is maybe some voice came over the speakers, maybe the light started behaving in a certain way, and it's unclear if there's a true spirit now communicating with them because of the sacrifice from Zach, or maybe it was that last bit of science through the sounds and coordinating that whole thing with Martin and his drink, right? It would still be equally as mysterious, but I would have a little more to grab onto there than everyone just literally waking up on the ground and saying, all right, well, that was that. Let's head home now, right?
Yeah, at first I thought there was going to be kind of a deeper exploration of this kind of either difference or merging between kind of the mystic and the scientific, where you had like Zach was on the mystical side and the kind of religious side, where he was like, yeah, there's a spirit out here. We need to appease it. We need to worship it. We need to sacrifice to it. And then Dr. Wendell on the other side is like, no, there's a rational scientific explanation. There's some kind of entity that we just don't understand, and we're going to use a scientific method and a process of elimination to be able to communicate with it and find out what it wants. But as it turned out in the end, both of them started out from a point of science. They're both scientists and researchers going out into the woods to explore these phenomena, and they both descended into mysticism and paganism and these these weird rites involving human sacrifice. And so it was a complete movement away from science to the mystic, and there was no kind of commentary on that either way. There wasn't like an interesting dichotomy. It's like, no, both of these people went crazy out here and started trying to use human sacrifice to communicate. It's like, that's not really interesting to me, where it was like, oh no, like we're taking the mystic and the the mystical and the scientific and kind of merging them and combining them, even though like in the real world, it's like it's all nonsense. But in the case of the story, it'd be really, really interesting. It's like, when they talk about, it reminds me of, in a weird way, about the first Thor movie, where he says like, oh yeah, we call it magic, but you call it science, and it's kind of like one and the same thing. It's just like different ways of explaining the same thing. It would have been cool to have. That's another theme. I can't believe I'm drawing thematically on Thor, of all things. But like that would have been a cool theme to explore. It's like, oh no, like these mystic rites were just another approach to understanding the world, and like mysticism and science, you use them in combination, and they're different approaches to the same thing. But it's like, there wasn't that either. It was just like, all of a sudden at the end, they just blew everything up, and everything kind of dispersed like fungal particles in a mist, and nothing was there were no connections narratively to be able to put together any kind of real meaning from it, from my perspective anyway. I don't know.
No, I think those insights are really good. And I also have an issue where the movie's in the greater context of this post-pandemic world, and nothing that the characters do, nothing that they're researching out there has anything to do possibly with the virus that supposedly has like wiped out a good portion of the population, has maybe made this forest unique in some way. We don't get to go back to that virus, because we're always kind of curious, like, all right, this is a science movie initially because we're dealing with the sciences in the woods in a post-pandemic world. Well, it stands to reason that they're researching the virus, and maybe they're trying to find a cure or something, but there's literally none of that stuff. They're just out in the woods trying to conjure some forest spirit, which would be a fine movie on its own, but the greater context of it has me confused walking into the movie thinking this is going to be a virus film. It has nothing to do with a virus. It has more to do with a forest spirit.
Well, I had the exact same thought initially. It's like, you mentioned you're in the midst of a global pandemic, and then I was like, oh, well, the research they're doing out in the woods then has to do with helping solve this crisis. Like, no, it didn't.
No, not at all.
Completely unrelated. It's like, it's like, why bring up the pandemic then, right? At all, other than to make like a connection to our real world. But it's like, then why not call it COVID-19? Why be coy about it, right? It was just a lot of bizarre choices, and maybe there's fans of Ben Wheatley out there who are like, you just don't get it, man, and you could be right. Maybe I just don't get it. But it's like, for whatever reason, this movie didn't click with me. Whatever Mr. Wheatley was trying to say, I didn't pick up what he was putting down.
Yeah, and honestly, I'd probably have this exact same thing to say about the movie High Rise. I just did not get it. At the end of it, I was just like, I watched a film, stuff happened, and I couldn't be less interested in it, to be honest. This one was a little more interesting, maybe because it skews horror. There's a couple good elements to it. Obviously, the science spiritualism thing was fun. The gore was fun to watch if you're into that sort of thing. And this is a horror film, which I didn't even know what genre this movie was when I started watching it. So I didn't understand at first why there was so much gore until I look, and it's like, no, it's a horror through and through. But I didn't get that whole sense out of it. Honestly, at the end of it, I'm just thinking of a different movie which does everything so much better, is The Ritual, which is on Netflix, I think. I don't know if you've seen it, and I won't spoil it at all, but it is such a better movie than this one. And of course, they have different themes to it, but there's so much more substance in The Ritual that I just recommend going to watch that instead of this movie.
Are a couple other movies that are better that this reminded me of are another recent one, Color Out of Space.
Yes.
It wasn't exactly the same, but again, it dealt with like nature as a force of chaos rather than harmony.
Mm-hmm.
And then another one it reminded me of, I think you mentioned already, was Annihilation, for slightly different reasons. Again, just like just being out and that kind of, people against nature and seeing that, trying to communicate, essentially trying to understand nature, understand forces of nature. But yeah, there are, I think, better films that touch on this. I think part of the problem, what got to me, was that the movie tonally was a little bit all over the place. On the one hand, it started off as like, oh, this feels like a typical slasher setup. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh no, now we're delving into like cosmic horror. And it just really didn't merge well together. Like for example, in something like The Void, where it's like, yeah, you got a lot of blood and gore, but overall it's a cosmic horror, right? It's about how that the blood and gore is in the context of this larger entity trying to take over the world and forces beyond our comprehension. But this one, if it would have focused more on that, or made it a slasher flick, it would have been more kind of mundane, as just like, oh, here's another slasher flick. But like, focus on that, or focus on the cosmic horror. But it just felt like it was trying to do both, and it kind of failed at both of them then.
Yeah. And I guess like Wheatley had a good like premise in mind here, and I think in the context of our real world pandemic going on, in the IMDb trivia, it's saying this movie was conceived, written, and produced in quarantine, which would help put the movie into some kind of context there of why it is in a post-pandemic world. But overall, the film just didn't really benefit from that. I think the other interesting thing I read was that the film was only shot within 15 days, which is always kind of fun to see. Like such, I mean, there seemed to be some decent production value here. Obviously, all the gore and stuff was in there, some good effects, but yeah, nice 15-day shooting schedule. The movie is quick to market, so to speak.
Well, really, it's pretty straightforward. I don't want to say it's pretty straightforward to shoot, but it's pretty kind of contained. There's four main characters, and I think we see like two other characters on screen.
We do, yeah, at the
very beginning, and then there's a couple dead bodies. But really, you got a cast of 4 people, minimal sets. I mean, I give props to Mr. Wheatley and his crew and his cast for shooting this and making this. It's well made, it's well shot, it's well acted. It just, in terms of theme and narrative, it just did not come together for me. And I'm not saying that all films have to be narratively driven. I mean, I think we've talked about offline things like Black Bear we've seen recently. Fantastic film. Not narratively driven at all, right? Not based on any kind of narrative structure that makes any kind of sense, but still fantastic film. But in this case, there just wasn't enough of a skeleton. There wasn't enough thematically to counteract that kind of maybe lack of narrative, or wasn't enough narratively to counteract that lack of theme.
So with all that being said, we know this is a not recommended film, but what do you score In the Earth?
Oh, this is a tough one. I'm still working this out. I
purposely left my Letterboxd score off. Like I've been thinking about it for a few days. It's like, this seems like one that I need to go in. We'll talk about it on the podcast, and I'll end up at a rating, because quite often we talk about a movie and I end up rating it higher than I did on Letterboxd when I first watched it, just because I can get excited about it talking with you on it. But this one,
I mean,
does my rating go down?
Really, I haven't rated it for this. It's such a hard film to rate. I was gonna say somewhere between 2 and 2.5. I mean, I'm leaning more towards 2 out of 5 right now, because like it's a competently made movie. That sounds like really low bar praise. But it's like, from a cinematic perspective, it's well shot, it's well acted. but like I don't know what it was trying to. I don't know the story it was trying to tell. I don't know the themes it was trying to get across. I don't know what it was trying to say, if it was trying to say anything. So it was like I can't really. It just something fell flat for me. And so like between like the 2 stars would be for just like the filmmaking, the quality of the filmmaking, but like the other 3, which is like the actual like what am I supposed to engage with? Which for me,
that's
not
fair.
a whole lot.
Yeah, I think I would put this film at 2.5 stars. Absolutely, like it's a 50% film that I didn't hate it. I didn't love it. It really does fall directly down the center of mediocrity for me.
Yep.
I do believe that the movie, if it was 15 minutes shorter, would have been a much stronger film as something as more of an experience than trying to have a longer runtime. Like, it's 107 minutes long. It's not super long, but it's long enough that a shorter film might have done this film's concepts a bit better, might have served the film better. But yeah, I mean, there was a lot of things not to grab onto in this film. There were only a few elements that I really enjoyed out of it. So that's where we're at for In the Earth.
Yeah, I mean, the whole overall concept was really cool. Having this entity out in the woods and like this essentially a personification of the, you know, the human fears of the unknown and human fears of, you know, the darkness in the woods. There's something very primal about that. It's like, and then playing with that back and forth. Is this an actual entity? Just like a biological entity that we just don't know, understand yet? Is nature just a giant biological entity that we need to communicate with? Or are there actual spiritual, paranormal components to this existence that we need to explore? And if you're exploring that in a more kind of coherent way, that's really compelling stuff, right? But as it was just kind of, it was like a cloud of smoke. It was too obscure to really, for me anyway, it was too obscure for me to really see anything, not of value, but anything that of substance, right? I don't know. At the end of the day, are you going to pick this up on Blu-ray?
That's a good question. And that's a no on picking this up. That being said, if it was $1 or $2 in the bargain bin at some point, maybe I would pick it up. Probably not, though. Like I think we said before, I'm most likely going to forget about this film in a week or two. It'll just sort of mesh into the background of similar films and better films, basically. Would you buy it?
Again, I would have to say it's not on my priority list.
Yeah.
I'm not rushing out to pick this film up. If it ended up in a bargain bin somewhere, I might, just as a curiosity, but it's I wouldn't recommend picking it up. I wouldn't rush out to buy this film. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. No, that's pretty fair. So I think that pretty much wraps up our conversation on In the Earth, another film that I thought maybe we might disagree on, but no, it looks like we follow the same path, which is fine. We had some good discussions out of it for sure. That's been episode number 10.
As always, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, this has been a blast. Thanks a lot for listening, and stay safe out there. We will talk to you again soon.